Hello there. For all my wanderers, beholders of curiosities or otherwise ghoulish fiends, take heed, and consider this a prelude, a warning, perhaps, before you choose to inquire thus further, as we venture into the world of horror, a world that is not as far or as different from ours as we like to think. A world that might never be understood and perhaps shouldn't be. Come and uncover with me tales of dread, chronicles of the uncanny, explorations into the strange and scary, and for all the things that go bump in the night. I am Ravenna Grim, and this is Behind the Button Eye.
Today, we move into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. We've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone. Nightmare as a Child, Season 1, Episode 29, originally aired on April 29th, 1960. The episode begins with our protagonist, Helen Foley, as she's on her way to unlock the door of her apartment, but decides to stop and say hello to a girl sitting on the stairs. Helen asks the girl questions like, "How are you?" if she's new or just visiting, but the girl doesn't respond. In fact, she doesn't really make any sort of acknowledgement to Helen at all. Helen is not dismissed, though, and continues trying to talk to her. She remarks how the little girl is quiet, but that she's an expert on children, quiet ones and loud ones, and that she teaches out of school. The girl then looks at Helen and says, I know all about you." Still unperturbed, Helen offers the girl to come inside her apartment for a cup of hot chocolate and mentions how she always has hot chocolate when she comes home from school. The pair moves to the door, and as Helen goes to unlock it, the girl says, "I know, but you don't like marshmallows, do you?" This time, Helen appears a little taken back by this comment, but just says that the girl is right. Once going inside, the girl sits in a chair, and Helen brings up how they should probably let the girl's mother know where she's at, so she doesn't worry. The girl says that won't be necessary. Helen doesn't ask any further questions on this, but says she'll put the milk on. The girl explains that she's in no hurry, which does cause a brief look of unease on Helen's face before she continues towards the kitchen. A bit of time passes and we see Helen hand the drink to the girl, who takes a sip. The girl comments on how she's glad it isn't too hot since she doesn't really like very hot things. Helen says that she doesn't blame her for that. The girl says, "Of course you don't. You got burnt once. That scar right below your elbow, you remember?" Helen, now sounding a little mad, says of course she remembers. But when the girl asks how it happened, Helen becomes flustered and says that she doesn't actually remember, and that there are a lot of things she doesn't recall at a certain age. The girl explains that she knows that, and that she knows all about Helen. Changing subjects, the girl asks if people look familiar to Helen, but Helen doesn't know quite what she means. The girl gives some examples like, when you're passing people on the street or see them at a bank, if they look familiar. Helen says sometimes, and the girl asks if that happened today, if someone went by her today that looked familiar. Helen, with some anger in her tone, flatly says no, but this only makes the girl smile a bit and mockingly say, "Really?" More sternly, Helen says that it isn't polite to contradict people, and she already told her that she didn't. However, Helen looks away as though she was recollecting something. The girl asks, "Did you remember?" A mix of sadness and confusion crosses Helen's face as she says, "Yes, there was someone." The girl says, "Outside the school, when you were crossing the street, there was a man in a car." Helen goes back into the kitchen and affirms that there was a man in a car stopped at a red light. The girl says that Helen recognized him. Helen denies recognizing him, even though he looks so familiar to you, the girl says, finishing Helen's sentence. The girl says that the man made Helen frightened. Helen sort of ignores her at first and turns on a lamp, but the girl doesn't back off and says that of course the man frightened her. In a huff, Helen asks her what is she talking about. The girl says, I know he looks familiar, and I know he frightens me, just like he frightened you. Helen tries asking the girl again who she is and where she's from. The girl says that she lives around here and that she has a nickname that people call her, Marky. As the girl, or Marky, says this, Helen walks back over and sits across from her, not looking at her. Marky forcefully asks if she heard her. Helen says she did and calms down a little bit to say that it's a pretty name. Marky appears unimpressed and asks if that's all Helen has to say. Again, Helen says that it's a cute name, then gets up and starts walking again, asking Marky what more she wants her to say. Marky seems a little unsure now as Helen gets a handkerchief from her bag to pat her hands and face. Marky asks if she's feeling warm, and Helen says that it does feel a bit warm, but Marky doesn't think it is, and that it feels very comfortable even. Helen slowly starts walking towards Marky with a confused expression. But there's a noise outside of the apartment that causes Marky to leap up towards Helen. Sounding frightened, she explains that someone's coming. Helen tries to get a hold on Marky and says that they're not the only people on this floor and how there's other apartments, but Marky is still freaked out, saying that whoever is coming there and that she doesn't want to be there, that she'll go out the back door. Helen tells her there isn't anything to be afraid of, but Marky disagrees and says she'll come back later as she leaves. Almost immediately after Marky is out of sight, there is a knock at the door. For a second, Helen looks scared, but her face calms down and she asks, "Yes?" From the other side of the door, a man asks if she's Miss Helen Foley. Although a little hesitant, Helen goes towards the door and puts her hand on the handle saying it is, and then asks who's at the door. The man says his name is Peter Selden, and he's not sure if she remembers him, but that he knew her mother. Despite her uncertainty, she opens the door and Peter asks if she remembers him. Helen looks puzzled still, but smiles politely and says that he does look familiar. Then her face drops and she freaks out a little and says, "Didn't I see you?" Peter interrupts and says, "In front of the school. Yes, that's right." He continues and says that he was stopped at a red light and that he thought she looked at him a little oddly earlier. As he is already walking in, he asks if she minds if he comes into the apartment for a moment. Helen obliges and closes the door after him. Peter says that it's been many years since they've seen each other and muses that it's been about 18 or 19 years. They sit across from each other and Peter can tell she doesn't quite recognize him, so he says that she couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 at that time, but that he worked for her mother. Helen still doesn't recall and looks perplexed. Peter, sounding a little uneasy, brings up how after a tragic occurrence, Helen was ill for a long time and had issues with her memory, so he was wondering if her memory ever came back to her. Helen says only vague and disjointed things, but overall, nothing. Peter says that she was in the room when it happened, but Helen looks even more confused and asks when what happened. Peter says nothing, but now he is also looking confused. Helen explains to him that the doctor said she suffered a trauma, which caused her to be in shock. After she got better, she moved to Chicago to live with an aunt, and she only moved back in town about a year ago and teaches school now. Peter affirms that he heard that before, and he was passing through town on business when someone pointed Helen out to him, so he wanted to stop by. Helen's confusion still hasn't really lessened, and she asked about Peter working for her mother. He says that he worked for her mother for almost a year, and he handled some of her investments, but still, Helen says she doesn't recall. Peter says that it's great to see her grown up, and, rather creepily, says that he had quite a crush on her when she was a child, and that she's just as beautiful as she was when she was a little girl. His demeanor turns more serious as he says that he lived in the same apartment building when she was younger, and that he heard Helen screaming that night. Somewhat hesitantly, Peter says he was the first one to find her mother, and that it was a terrible thing her mother being killed like that. He asks Helen if they ever found the man who did it. Helen takes a moment to try to keep her composure, as it looks like she's about to cry, and says that she doesn't think they did, but that she can't be so sure because there's so many things she doesn't remember from that time. Helen looks distantly off as she continues. Waking up in my bed, hearing my mother scream, and I've seen this person. Peter asks if she saw his face, but Helen doesn't really know. That it's one of the things she's forgotten, or at least pushed out of her mind. Helen gets up with the cup that Marky had earlier and asked if he would like a cup of coffee or cocoa, and he declines. Suddenly, Helen stops and stares at the cup in her hands, prompting Peter to ask, "What's wrong?" Helen says that it's odd, that she thought she, meaning Marky but she doesn't say Marky, had finished her cocoa, but that it's completely untouched. She continues walking towards the kitchen to put the cup away and continues saying how odd it is, and how the girl herself was a rather odd little thing as well. Peter asks who she's talking about, and Helen says that there was a little girl here earlier and that she was strange, solemn, and wise. Peter decides that he should get going, and Helen starts leading him out, but says that she'll have to ask the girl how she was able to act like she was drinking cocoa without actually drinking it at all, and thoughtfully says, "Little Marky." This causes Peter to pause and ask about the name. Helen explains that it's a nickname and she doesn't actually know the child's real name. Puzzled, Peter says that Marky was Helen's nickname when she was a girl. Upon this revelation, we can hear Marky singing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," but the characters don't make any acknowledgement at this time. Helen walks away and seems a little startled, but just attributes it to being very coincidental. Helen smiles as she says that things are coming back to her, that she was called Marky and she hadn't thought of that in years. Peter says that he's sure that given time she'll remember a lot of things. He asks if the doctors told her that her memory of things would come back. Helen says they didn't know, then says how little Marky is full of talents. Peter is unsure what she means and she says Marky's singing. We can still hear Marky singing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," but Peter says that he doesn't hear anything. He suggests that maybe her hearing is better than his, but Helen looks distressed. Then the singing stops. Peter pulls out a snapshot of when Helen was a child to show her, and Helen's face immediately changes. Peter says that she looks so much like her mother, and that she especially does now. Helen appears uncomfortable, almost scared as she still looks at the photo. The camera cuts to the photo, and it's Marky, the girl we saw earlier. The scene changes to signal that some unknown amount of time has passed and Helen is laying down on the couch. It seems like she is having a flashback to when her mother was killed. A scene plays kind of over her face of two people fighting, a man and her mother, but it's more of their shadowed silhouettes. A little girl, assumingly Helen, is in bed and sits up, then starts screaming. The flashback ends and Helen hears Marky singing again. Helen opens her apartment door and sees Marky sitting on the stairs again. "Has that man left?" Marky asks her, and Helen nods, saying that he left some time ago, but that it's rather late and that Marky should probably go home because her mother will be worried. Marky says that she doesn't have a mother anymore. She says, "Do you remember now about Marky? Do you, Helen?" Helen says that she does remember, and Marky asks about the nasty burn she got on her arm, right below her elbow. Helen grabs Marky's arm and pushes her sleeve up, revealing that she has the same scar by her elbow. Helen becomes rather frantic and repeatedly tells Marky to tell her who she is. Marky says, "You don't know? You don't have any idea? And you were doing so well, Helen. You were starting to remember things." Helen lets go of Marky, looking defeated, asking, "Remember what things?" Marky walks in the apartment and picks up the picture, holding it out to Helen, asking if it looks familiar. Helen says that it's supposed to be her when she was Marky's age, but that it's not her, that it's actually a snapshot of Marky. Marky is upset that Helen still doesn't understand. She says that she is her, that she's Helen when she was 10 and was called Marky, that she is her from when she lived with her mother in an apartment and when a man came into the house and started arguing with their mother downstairs. When the mom ran into the bedroom, the man caught her and choked her and hit her on the head with something heavy. And then that's when Helen screamed, and the man looked at her. "Then you screamed so loud, Helen. You screamed so loud." As Helen turns around, she jumps out of fear, as it's Peter standing there and Marky is gone. He says that Helen has been living in ignorance for too long, but that he can see that it's coming back to her, and he wants to be the first to tell her. Peter reveals that the man who killed her mother was him. He explains that he was having trouble with her investments and came over that night to plead with the mother to cover for him, but she refused. He followed after her when she ran into Helen's room and killed her. He knew he would have to kill Helen as well, but her screams brought people there, so he had to flee. He said that he didn't find out until later that Helen had no recollection of who killed her mom. Helen tries to run, but Peter catches her, saying that he has always kept tabs on her because he knew one day she would start remembering things, and he would have to take care of unfinished business. Helen manages to push him and runs out of the apartment. She desperately tries knocking on the neighbors' doors, but Peter runs after her and attempts to grab her. During their struggle, Peter ends up falling down the stairs. Later on, we see Peter's body still on the ground and police and investigators surrounding him. A police lieutenant goes towards Helen's apartment and a doctor comes out. He asks the doctor if she's alright, and the doctor explains that he's given her a sedative. The doctor says that Helen is a fortunate person, and that she'd be a homicide victim if she was less fortunate. The lieutenant asks about the child she keeps talking about, and the doctor explains that the child is her, or at least that it was a part of her buried deep inside. A memory, a recollection that finally had to come out, and when it did, it took the form of herself as a child. The lieutenant comments on how weird it all is, and the doctor agrees, saying that the human imagination is often weird, but it sometimes means salvation. The pair walks away. We cut to Helen sitting on the couch when suddenly we hear Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star being sung. Concerned, Helen gets up and goes outside her apartment, only to be greeted by a girl holding a doll. A girl who isn't Marky, who's sitting on the stairs. Helen says that the girl has a lovely smile, and to never lose it. They both smile at each other, and Helen goes back into her apartment. Alvin Ganser is the director for this episode. Originally from Minnesota, he was a film and television director. Besides Nightmare as a Child, he directed a few other Twilight Zone episodes, all from Season 1, including Episode 12, What You Need, Episode 16, The Hitchhiker, and Episode 35, The Mighty Casey. He also was one of the directors for the TV series The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and is probably most known for being the director and co-writer for the movie The Leather Saint from 1956. He passed away in 2009 at 97. Rod Serling was the one who wrote Nightmare as a Child. Some have speculated or wondered if he got inspiration for the story from a short story by Truman Capote called Miriam. It was originally published in the June 1945 issue of Mademoiselle. Throughout the years, people have noticed some similarities between the two, but it has never been confirmed if Miriam inspired Nightmare as a Child in any way. One inspiration we do know that Rod Serling had for the story lies with the character Helen Foley, who was named after a teacher he had in high school. The name Helen Foley would also show up again in the It's a Good Life segment of Twilight Zone the movie. There are three main stars in this episode. Janice Rule plays the protagonist Helen Foley. Originally from Ohio, she was an actress that performed on stage, TV, and in movies, and later on was also a psychotherapist. Her first credited screen role was Virginia in Goodbye My Fancy in 1951. One of the films she is most known for is her role in the 1958 movie Bell, Book, and Candle. During the 1960s, she first became interested in psychoanalysis and in 1973 began her education. 10 years later, she received her PhD and practiced in New York and LA, while occasionally acting until her death in 2003 at 72. Terry Burnham steals the show as Marky. Originally from California, she was a child actress that mostly made appearances in TV shows, like Shirley Temple's Storybook, M Squad, and Family Affair. She retired from acting in 1971 and later passed away in 2013 at 64. Shepard Strudwick plays the creepy Peter Selden in this episode. Originally from North Carolina, like Janice Rule, he was an actor of film, TV, and stage. Over the course of his life, he acted in at least 30 Broadway plays. For some of his films and stage acting, he was known as the name John Shepard instead. Some of his films include The Loves of Edgar Allan Poe from 1942 and A Place in the Sun in 1951. His last appearance on film was a TV movie from 1981 called Kent State. He passed away in 1983 at 75. Besides the three major character roles in this episode, there are a few minor ones that I'll talk about said actors briefly, but probably not that briefly. Michael Fox plays the doctor we see at the end of the episode. He was an actor who is most well known for his reoccurring roles as various autopsy physicians in TV shows, such as Perry Mason, Burke's Law, and The Bold and the Beautiful. I think the most interesting thing I found while researching him was his connection to the Dr. Fox effect. He portrayed Dr. Myron L. Fox in a study where he gave an engaging lecture that didn't have any meaningful context, but the audience rated the lecture just as highly as an actual professor's lecture. Basically, the Dr. Fox effect is often referred to when people talk about educational seduction, which is about an instructor's expressiveness and how entertaining their delivery style is, makes up for the lack of meaningful content, leading to the audience thinking that the content was actually meaningful. Michael Fox passed away in 1996 at 75. Joseph V. Perry played the police lieutenant. His film career began when he was around 24 and appeared in tons of films and TV shows for the next 45 years of his life. He mostly played criminals or police officers in TV shows. He is probably best known for his reoccurring role as Nemo in Everybody Loves Raymond. He passed away in 2000 at 69. Morgan Brittany is the little girl on the stairs at the end of the episode. Although she has a speaking part, she is uncredited for the episode. Nightmare as a Child is the first of 3 Twilight Zone episodes she appears in. She appears in Season 4, Episode 3, Valley of the Shadow, and Season 5, Episode 28, Caesar and Me. Something that I thought was kind of fun and interesting was that she also had an uncredited role in Alfred Hitchcock's 1963 movie, The Birds, and is specifically in the birthday party and schoolhouse scenes. At the date of this video, she is currently 73. Memory is the diary that we all carry about with us. But what happens when pages are torn and missing? When chunks of memory have all but disappeared? Or when it's all locked up tight and you're without a key? Our memory can be thought of not only as a diary, but really a library of records. Thoughts, feelings, personality, and identity. Memories allow us to know our history, our story. Sometimes, though, we aren't privy to memories as a way of protection. A quick note before we continue. I am not a professional, nor am I an expert. If it isn't obvious when it comes to subjects of psychology and science in general, I am conveying research that is not of my own findings, but that I have gathered from actual professionals and/or reliable sources. Please do not use what I say as a diagnosis. But if anything is resonating with you, please seek actual professional help, such as a therapist. Now, we can go back on track. Children are considered to be the most vulnerable to the effects of a traumatic event. Trauma is when we experience very stressful, frightening, or distressing events that are difficult to cope with or out of our control. It could be one incident or an ongoing event that happens over a long period of time. Witnessing a traumatic event also counts as trauma, especially if it's of a loved one or caregiver. Helen witnessed her mother being killed when she was about 10 years old, which is already incredibly horrific and painful. Adding even more distress, though, is that her mother was killed by someone they both knew. Pretty quickly, Helen's memory was affected. After the murder, she's under care of doctors for an undetermined amount of time, but we get the sense that it was for a while. She has no memory of the man and is even unsure if she even saw his face. She also gets to a point where she really has no memory of the event itself and even of her life around that time in general. One of the potential effects from trauma is dissociation, which, quote, is a change in consciousness that mentally disconnects a person from their body, from other aspects of themselves, and/or from people and their surroundings, end quote. Dissociation comes in various forms, but each type is determined by what the core self is disassociating from. The concept of the core self has been defined in numerous ways, but when it comes to dissociation, think of it being the fundamental essence of who you are, the central part of you that is always there and has always been there throughout your life. One type of dissociation is dissociative amnesia. It's when someone can't remember personal history, usually related to a traumatic event or parts of it. Quote, this is a detachment of the core self from certain, usually painful memories, end quote. Basically, How dissociative amnesia disconnects from the core self is by disconnecting from memories, especially traumatic ones. Quote, a person may not recall parts of a traumatic incident, blocks of time, or extended periods. Some individuals with early childhood trauma histories report that they don't remember much of their childhood at all. End quote. You might be wondering what's the purpose or reason why the brain blocks memories following a traumatic experience. Earlier, I briefly mentioned how sometimes we aren't privy to memories as a way of protection. Quote, one of the most common reasons your mind blocks out things is to protect you from unpleasant, distressing, or traumatic experiences. It's not the same as simply forgetting something. In most cases, you still have the memories but can't access them. End quote. If you think about our memories as a library, the brain goes through a process of encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is the brain forming the memory, as though it's writing and publishing a new book for your library of memories. Storage is, well, as you've probably guessed it, how the brain stores the memories. You can think of it like the filing system, like your brain's own Dewey Decimal System. Retrieval is all about being able to recall a memory, so like being able to open the book or open the memory and see what's inside. Memory isn't dealt with in one specific area of the brain, but we're going to focus specifically on the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex for a second. Trauma and, furthermore, conditions such as PTSD can affect the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex, which are all vital to memory. Trauma can affect how memories are encoded, stored, and/or retrieved, so it makes sense why dissociative amnesia is a possibility. However, memory loss can show up in different forms. For some people, they may only have one form, but for others, they could experience multiple forms of memory loss. We're only going to focus on a couple forms that seem pretty relevant for Helen's memory loss, which are selective and generalized. Selective memory loss only affects one event or all events of a certain type within a specific period in someone's life. It will affect certain memories, but it won't affect others. The generalized form is when memory loss impacts practically everything within a period of months or years. With Helen, she pretty much has virtually no memory of the traumatic event. Even when Peter starts talking about it by referring to it as the horrible thing that happened when she was a child, she doesn't know what he's talking about. He pretty much has to declaratively say that her mother was not only killed, but that Helen witnessed it. This comes across as selective memory loss. However, it's not just the traumatic event she doesn't really recall, but she mentions numerous times throughout the episode that she doesn't really remember much around that time when she was a child. It's unknown to the extent of what she doesn't remember, but it does seem to be within a period of months and possibly even longer, suggesting she might be experiencing generalized memory loss. One form of memory loss I didn't mention previously, but I think could also possibly apply, is the systemized form. Basically, it affects a specific topic or category, which can include a person or people. When it comes to Helen, she doesn't remember Peter. Even with being told his first and last name, seeing him, or him saying that he worked for her mother, she can't recall. She is able to recall that she's the man she saw earlier that day in a car at a red light. I think also, weirdly enough in a way, this systemized form can sort of apply to her childhood self. At least herself when she was 10. When she first sees Marky, there is no recognition of her being herself when she was younger. This further continues when she tells Helen that her nickname is Marky. Again, there is no recognition. It's not until Peter tells Helen that she was called Marky as a child that she even makes that connection in any way. Still, she mostly attributes that to being a coincidence. She still is not putting the pieces together. Later on, Peter shows Helen a picture of herself when she was a child. It's kind of the big moment of the episode. The picture of her as a child is Marky. Marky is her. Even with seeing this, however, it doesn't connect right away. In fact, Helen denies that it is her, and when Marky returns, she tells her that it isn't a picture of her, but of Marky. The level of denial that Helen shows throughout the episode is actually understandable. Quote, even when people are aware of the missing memories, they'll usually avoid, minimize, or rationalize why they can't remember. End quote. Usually the main part of dissociative amnesia, or memory loss due to trauma, is protection. protection from the pain, protection from the fear. Therefore, it makes sense that being told or shown things that are related to the trauma could cause a level of avoidance, minimization, or rationalization. Although it can be difficult to do that, especially in the face of evidence to the contrary, it's sometimes not as difficult as actually facing and remembering it. To remember means you have to accept, and for Helen, having to accept that her mother was killed and she witnessed it, and witnessed who did it, is at least at that point in time still too painful to remember. Besides the more obvious examples of her avoidance, minimization, or rationalization when it comes to her memories and memory loss, her whole life, in fact, is an example. Quote, "The 20 or so years since her childhood trauma have revolved entirely around forgetting said trauma and building routine upon routine to fill the day. She does not think of the past. She does not even recognize herself as a child. She lives alone, she teaches school, and she invites strange children in to have hot chocolate." End quote. By the end of the episode, it seems like Helen has access to all her memories. This could be true, but there's a few things that leave me questioning it for certain. For starters, it never gets revealed how Helen got the scar by her elbow. We know she was burnt, but we don't know more than that. It doesn't come across that this is just one of the memories she's forgotten because it occurred around the same time as her mother's murder. For one, we don't know exactly when it happened, but it appears that how she got the scar was another traumatic event for her. Part of our understanding of this comes from when Marky remarks how she's glad that the hot chocolate isn't hot because she doesn't really like very hot things, and then references the scar. Since Marky is Helen, it's safe to assume that even though she doesn't remember how the scar happened, that it still has influenced her to not liking hot things in general. What I'm going to discuss next is also more of speculation since nothing is definitively confirmed, but there's enough details to leave you wondering, or at least feel rather uncomfortable. We know that Peter killed Helen's mom and that his motivation was because he was doing sketchy things with some of her investments and she was most likely going to report him. By being a murderer and also later revealed to be a stalker as well, already sets up that Peter is not a great dude. However, there's another aspect to Peter's character that really got under my skin and made the alarm bells go off in my head. Throughout Peter's visit with Helen, he makes some rather inappropriate and just frankly weird comments to her. He says how wonderful it is to see Helen grow up the way she has and says that she's just as beautiful as she was when she was a child. Already, it's a little creepy, but maybe it can be attributed to just some odd wording if we're being generous. However, he quickly follows this up by saying that he had quite a crush on her. Immediately, what the fuck? Besides the already noticeable age difference in their appearance, we also know that Peter worked for Helen's mother when Helen was 10. I understand that when Peter was working for the mom, this would have taken place in the 40s, and in theory, he could have been young, but I don't think there's any way where he isn't predatory. Again, we know that Helen was 10. Peter says that it's been around 18 or 19 years since her mother's murder. This would place Helen to be in her late 20s. We can also look at Helen's actress, Janice Rule, who was around 28 or 29, depending on when they filmed. Shepard Strudwick, who played Peter, was around 52 or 53, depending on when they filmed. That's about a 24-year age difference, give or take, meaning he would have been around 34 when Helen was 10. Now, maybe the character he's playing is supposed to be younger than his actual age. When I was searching online, there were some reports that Peter was maybe around 20 when he worked for Helen's mom. Maybe that isn't a 24-year age difference, but that's still an adult man admitting to having a crush on a 10-year-old child. No matter what, get the police. Peter also makes another comment later on when he shows her the picture of Helen when she was a child and says that she was exceptionally beautiful. Besides the instances of Peter referring to Helen as a child being beautiful or about the crush he had on her, There's a moment earlier with Marky that stuck out to me. When Marky is questioning Helen about coming across people that seem familiar to her, she brings up the man Helen saw in the car stopped at the red light by the school earlier that day. The man being Peter. Marky says, "He made you frightened, didn't he?" And when Helen ignores her, she says, "Of course he did." Marky concludes it by saying that she knows he frightens her, just like he frightened Helen. It makes sense that Helen, and by extension Marky, would be frightened of Peter since he was the one who murdered her mother, even if she doesn't remember it at that time. I think without Peter's uncomfortable comments, that would be the only reason why Helen was frightened of Peter, which is a completely understandable reason on its own on why someone would be scared of them. But I also can't ignore the subtext of Peter's comments, especially given the point of time when this episode came out. Sexual assault and therefore child sexual abuse and pedophilia were topics that weren't exactly discussed in the late 50s and early 60s, especially when it came to movies and television shows. The Twilight Zone was known for tackling topics that were considered taboo, especially in regard to mental health and illness, and the depravity humans are capable of. Therefore, I don't think these comments from Peter weren't anything but purposeful. Whether to indicate that something more happened prior to Helen's mom being murdered, or at the very least to show that Peter had inappropriate, criminal, and overall deplorable thoughts about Helen when she was a child. Given the time this episode came out and that it also was in the first season of the show, it probably wasn't a feasible option to include anything more concrete or direct. Regardless, I think it's more than effective at what they do convey. A little girl guided and walked Helen into a nightmare. That little girl being herself. Or at least, a part of herself. A memory. One that was hidden and buried, but resurfaced in the form of herself as a child to try and save her. To try and have her remember. It's like what the doctor said towards the end of the story. How the human imagination is often weird, but that sometimes it means salvation. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. A thunderstorm started while I was recording the audio, so I apologize if that was picked up at all. If you enjoyed the video, please give a like or comment, and if you want to see more videos like this, I'd greatly appreciate it if you'd subscribe to this channel. Let me know your thoughts about this Twilight Zone episode and if there's any other episodes you would like me to cover. My long-term goal is that I ideally want to cover every Twilight Zone episode at some point, but if there's any episode you would like to see sooner than later, let me know. Thank you for venturing with me into the world of horror. Farewell and safe departures, my little ghouls.